What is it that stops power from becoming absolute? I mean, really, what keeps it in check? Well, it's not a person or a weapon. It's an idea. An incredibly powerful idea that people have argued and even died for over thousands of years. It's called the rule of law. And this isn't some dusty old concept. It's a living principle that's evolved from divine commands all the way to the digital code that shapes our lives today. So let's trace that amazing journey. Now, this summary is based on the fantastic work of Professor Vihar Kiskinov, and here's the roadmap for our discussion. First, we're going to nail down what the rule of law actually means. Then, we'll rewind the clock to see where it all began, deep in ancient history. After that, we'll jump into the middle of a huge power struggle. We're talking gods versus kings. From there, you'll see how the modern system we know today was built, piece by piece. And finally, we'll bring it right into the present day to see how this ancient idea is grappling with a totally connected digital world. It's going to be a fascinating trip.
All right, so first things first. Before we can track how this idea grew and changed, we have to get on the same page. What exactly is the rule of law?
At its very core, the rule of law is a promise. It's a promise a society makes to itself, saying, we agree to be governed by established rules, not by the mood or whim of a ruler. It's about creating a system that aims for equality, order, and justice for all. The key takeaway here is that the law is supposed to govern the government itself. Nobody is above it. And this isn't just some high-minded theory, It has very real effects on 3 different levels. For the state, it puts a leash on power. It says you can only act within the law. For society as a whole, it means we all know the rules of the game so we can plan our lives and build things together. And for you as an individual, it's your shield. It protects your rights and makes sure you have a fair shot at justice. So where did this game-changing idea even come from? Well, to find its source, we need to go way, way back. The notion that there's a higher order that even a king has to answer to is ancient. But in the beginning, that order wasn't seen as human at all. If you look at the big picture, you could see a really clear evolution. In Mesopotamia, law was literally considered a gift from the gods. Then the ancient Greeks came along and started to make a distinction, separating divine law from the laws that people create. And finally, in Rome, law went from being this sacred, secret knowledge to a full-blown professional field of study. Now, just stop and think about that for a second. If law comes from the gods, it's perfect. It can't be changed. So a ruler like Hammurabi wasn't a lawmaker like a modern president or prime minister. Nope. His job was just to carry out this divine will. In that system, the king was actually the law's #1 servant, not its master. Then the ancient Greeks took a huge mental leap forward. They were some of the first to really separate law into 2 buckets. In one bucket, you had what they called phos. This was divine, natural law that was the same for everyone, everywhere, forever. But in the other bucket, they put ius. These were the specific written laws made by humans for their own cities. And this was a massive deal because it meant that ius, our laws, could be debated, criticized, and even improved. And that new way of thinking basically lit the fuse on a conflict that would rage for centuries. Because if people can make laws, then the big question is, whose will gets to be the law? Is it God's, the king's, or the people's? Under the Roman Empire, the pendulum swung hard toward the ruler. The famous Roman jurist Ulpian said it plainly, the principes is not bound by the laws. The princeps, the emperor, was above the law. This was a complete 180 from the old ideal. It meant the emperor's will was the law, which is pretty much the exact opposite of the rule of law. This tension just exploded in the Middle Ages. You had kings on one side saying, hey, God chose me to rule, so what I say goes. But on the other side, you had the church saying, hold on a minute, we're the ones who actually interpret God's will, so our law is supreme. This was a heavyweight title fight for legal and spiritual authority that lasted for centuries. And this is a great example of how new ideas can be used in a power struggle. To push back against the church, lawyers supporting the kings came up with a new concept, positive law. It was a term for law that was simply posited or put in place by humans. Just giving it a name was a brilliant move. It created a separate category from man-made law and gave it its own legitimacy. The final revolutionary piece of the puzzle came from thinkers like John Locke. He argued that the ultimate power to make law doesn't come from a god or a king. It comes from the people themselves, who then entrust that power to a legislature. This was the birth of the modern idea that law is supreme because it reflects the will of the governed. Okay, so the power source for law has shifted to the people. What's next? Well, the next big challenge was figuring out how to actually build a system that makes this idea work in the real world. How do you turn a philosophy into a functioning government? During the Enlightenment, people got very excited about the power of reason. They thought you could build a legal system kind of like you'd build a proof in geometry. You start with a few self-evident truths, they call them axioms, like all people have natural rights. Then you just use pure logic to build out a whole perfectly rational and fair system of laws from there. And this is where we have to make a really, really important distinction. You see, there's the rule of law, and then there's rule by law. They sound similar, but they are worlds apart. The rule of law means everyone, and I mean everyone, especially the government, has to follow the rules. The law is the boss. But rule by law, well, that's when a government uses the law as a weapon, as a tool to control people. The laws are there, sure, but they only apply to you, not to the ones in power. Knowing the difference between these two is, frankly, everything. So to make sure governments followed the rule of law and didn't just rule by law, modern nations built this brilliant framework of institutions, things like the separation of powers, courts that could protect citizens' rights, and eventually fully independent constitutional courts. These aren't just buzzwords. You can think of them as the actual machinery designed to keep power in check and make the rule of law a reality. So that brings us pretty much to the present day. But the story is far from over. Right now, this ancient principle is being stretched and challenged by two gigantic forces, globalization and the digital revolution. Take the European Union, for example. In many areas, EU law actually trumps the national laws of its member countries. This creates a whole new level of legal authority that didn't exist before. It forces us to ask a tough new question. If national law isn't the highest power anymore, what law is truly supreme in a world this interconnected? And then you've got technology. For all of history, applying the law was a human process. But now we're seeing this dematerialized process take hold. The rule isn't just in a law book anymore. It's written directly into computer code. Think about an automated system that issues a parking ticket or calculates your taxes. The tech applies the rule itself instantly. It's efficient, for sure, but it raises some huge new questions. Like, how do you argue with an algorithm? Where's the human element of fairness? So, after this incredible journey, from stone tablets passed down by gods to digital code flying around the world, we're left with a pretty profound question. What is the future of this foundational principle? Here's the bottom line. The fundamental principle is as important today as it has ever been. We must be governed by consistent laws, not by arbitrary power. But, and this is a big but, the tools we use to defend that principle have to evolve. In this new digital age, we can't just rely on the old ways. We have a shared responsibility to invent and build new mechanisms that make the rule of law a living reality, not just a nice idea. Which leaves us with one final thought to chew on. In a world of global networks, where decisions can be made instantly by automated code, what does it really mean for us and for the generations to come to be governed by law?